Andy, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Today we're talking about all of the medical advances that are taking place in the biopharma industry. And they're occurring across many different disease categories and at such a rapid pace. I think you've been investing in this space now for more than 2 decades. And I've heard you say that the innovation that's occurring is unprecedented right now. But one area that has garnered maybe by far the most research is cancer. Why is cancer such an area of focus in research right now?
Sure. Well, cancer represents, I think, one of the biggest unmet medical needs in the world right now. It's currently the number 2 cause of death. 10 million people are dying every year still from cancer. And 40% of us will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in our lifetime. So this represents a huge unmet medical need, and we're spending over $1 trillion each year treating it. So this is one of the biggest focus areas for R&D from the biopharma industry today.
Because the market opportunity is so big and the need is so big, right?
Absolutely. And if you think about it, we've been treating cancer now for about 120 years. Back in around 1900, we started treating with radiation. For 70 years, we've been using chemotherapy. But when we think about what chemotherapy is, it's essentially a chemical that basically attacks all dividing cells in your body. And so that can be helpful because cancer cells are dividing rapidly, but so are many other cells in the body. And so it's not very specific, and it causes a lot of side effects. But what's exciting today, and really over the last 25 years, the progress we've made is using a more targeted approach. And really by understanding the underlying biology that causes cancer, we're getting much better therapies that can be both more effective and also safer and better tolerated for the patients.
Can you describe maybe a few of those therapies? I know there's a lot that's come out in the last decade or so.
Absolutely. So first of all, let's think about how we diagnose cancer. And historically, we would diagnose cancer by which tissue type was affected. So we could look in a microscope and we could say, oh, you have lung cancer or breast cancer or kidney cancer. But through advances in genetic sequencing, we can now identify specific genetic defects that are the cause of cancer. And so instead of saying a patient has lung cancer, we can identify 100 different mutations that can be different causes of lung cancer, and we can directly target those underlying genetic defects. So, for example, we could come up with small molecule drugs that can intervene in a pathway that leads to cancer in certain patients. And so you have therapies, for example, that can target a defect that maybe is only for 1% of cancer patients, but if you can identify the correct patients, you can get very significant improvements in survival with a well-tolerated once-a-day pill. We're also using now what we think of as precision-guided missiles. So these are what we call antibody-drug conjugates. And that's a lengthy term, but what it means is we're using an antibody that can be precisely targeted to a cancer cell and then attaching the chemotherapy like a payload onto those antibodies. And so instead of just giving chemotherapy broadly throughout the body, you're delivering chemotherapy very precisely to the cancer cell.
What about, I hear a lot about something called immunotherapy and cell therapies. What does that do in terms of fighting cancer?
Sure. So immunotherapy is another new way of treating cancer. And so cancer cells have mutations on their surfaces that should make them identifiable by the immune system because it should look different. But the cancer cells are smart, and they've found ways to hide from the immune system, almost like they have a cloaking device. But we're finding new ways to actually unlock the immune system and take the brakes off where it allows the immune system to identify and kill these cancer cells. And so a drug like Keytruda, for example, which is the leader in this field, was able to lower the risk of cancer death by 50% for a certain subset of patients with lung cancer, which is the biggest cancer that affects people worldwide. So that was a huge breakthrough. You mentioned cell therapies, or what we call CAR T therapy. So this is another way of harnessing the immune system to attack and kill cancer cells. And so in this approach, you're taking immune cells out of the body and then reprogramming them using genetic engineering so that they can also identify and attack and kill cancer cells. And then you reinfuse them in the body and you can have dramatic benefits.
You mentioned that genetic sequencing is such an important part of the advances that are taking place, and I'm just wondering, how are researchers able to pinpoint those mutations within cancer patients?
Yeah, I think, so we've been talking about sort of cancer treatments, and those are obviously extremely important. But I think the one that's going to have the biggest impact over the next decade or two is early cancer screening. And so we talked about the tremendous advances in genetic sequencing. Those advances have gotten so precise now that you can identify tiny amounts of cancer genetic material that's floating around in our blood. And the reason this is so important is today, most of the way that we identify cancer is through imaging. And the problem is you can't detect it in imaging until the cancer has reached a certain size, maybe a centimeter. But by that point, it's often too late. So you're often detecting cancer when it's stage 3 or mostly stage 4, which is the final stage, which means it's metastatic and has already spread throughout the body. At that point, it's almost universally fatal. And in fact, the 5-year survival, if you detect cancer at stage 4, is only about 20%. But if you can detect cancer through a standard blood test at stage 1, when it's early stage and hasn't spread throughout the body, the 5-year survival then is 90%. So we think this can have an enormous impact on the treatment of cancer and could actually save hundreds of thousands of lives a year. And as a commercial opportunity, we think this could be over a $50 billion opportunity. And so there are multiple companies that are investing in this space and we think are going to make dramatic progress in the next few years. And in fact, the first early cancer screening test using blood is now available today on the market.
Oh, wow. And so that $50 billion is just for the screening component, not
Absolutely.
even the treatment.
And then the treatment would come after that. So yeah, it's an enormous market opportunity for investors.
And this is all just within cancer.
Right, and that's just one field in biotechnology of many.
Of the many, many diseases that we have to contend with in our daily lives. And so I was wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit about the broader opportunities that are out there and where we're seeing advances today.
Yeah, so another area where we're seeing huge progress is in genetic therapies. And so the ones we were talking about before, some of those were small molecule pills, some of those are antibody drug conjugates. But now we're actually getting down to changing genetic material itself. So instead of a pill that can act on a pathway, we can actually change a gene directly. We can use therapies that can turn genes on or turn genes off. And so we can actually control gene expression, which is really how our bodies function today. And so, just a few examples now. We have gene-based therapy. So often when you have a disease, it's because you have a single genetic defect that causes a disease. And some of these diseases are absolutely devastating. For example, with muscular dystrophy, where you're missing the key shock absorber for your muscles, these patients end up in wheelchairs in their teens and they generally die in their 20s. We now have a gene therapy that can potentially replace with a shortened version of that missing protein that is looking like it's highly effective for these patients. And that one will now be filed, this year and potentially launched next year.
But there are also more pedestrian categories of disease that their researchers are targeting. I think one is obesity, where we've seen some improvement recently in clinical trials. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So obesity is a huge unmet medical need. Some of the indications we've been talking about are relatively rare. They affect thousands or tens of thousands of patients. But obesity affects 100 million people in the US and over 1 billion people worldwide. So this is a very widespread problem that has just become worse and worse, and it's affecting everyone around the world, every country. And it's been very, very hard to treat. And anyone who's tried to go on a diet and failed, it's extremely difficult. And the old therapies that give you maybe mid-single-digit % weight loss. Yeah. But often they worked while you took them for 12 weeks, and then patients would go off and regain the weight quickly. But now we're starting to understand the underlying biology that causes both hunger as well as energy expenditure. And we're starting to harness those pathways to develop new therapies that are much more effective than anything that's come before. And in fact, now we're starting to approach therapies that have 20% weight loss. Which is pretty significant. And so when we think about clinical outcomes, patients that are significantly overweight are at increased risk of almost every disease, from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even cancer are all tied to obesity. So we think if these really pan out, and there's a lot of progress in the field now with 2 of these therapies available today, this could be a over $10 billion market, maybe $20, $30 billion type of market that can also have an enormous benefit on patient welfare.
You said a key thing right there, which is if they pan out. Drug development is inherently risky. I've heard you throw out some pretty scary numbers before where 90% of drugs that enter human clinical trials never make it to market. So how, as an investor, do you mitigate that downside risk?
So we call this binary event. So it's kind of amazing. And the reason drug development is so expensive is there is a high failure rate. And you're right, for drugs that begin human clinical testing, 90% of them will never make it to market. That's very challenging odds. What we try to do is really understand the science and the business behind these companies developing these therapies. So our team, we actually have 3 PhDs and an MD that help us try to dig in and understand the science. We want to understand how these molecules actually work down to the molecular level. And for a therapy to be successful, you have to get the right therapy to the right place at the right patient in sufficient quantities. And everything has to be lined up for a therapy to be effective. And if anything is off, we find they often fail. So it's really important to understand the science, and we think that helps develop insight as to which of these therapies, the few, that can actually make it all the way to market. And when you have a therapy that changes the practice of medicine, we think those therapies that can really make a difference will do well regardless of the economic environment. They generally tend to get good reimbursement, and they can create enormous commercial opportunities.
Some of that commercial opportunity of drug development comes from the companies that are behind the research, but there's also opportunities for M&A and other deals where the risk is spread a little bit between companies. Is that correct?
So M&A has always been a big part of the biotech industry and really the pharmaceutical industry as well. If you think about a lifetime of a new therapy, these therapies take almost 10 years to develop, and then they're often on the market for 10, 12, 14 years, but then their patents expire. And so often the most successful drugs that have become the biggest in terms of sales are the ones that are losing their patents. And so if you think about it, it's almost like a treadmill that these companies are on. They always need new innovation. And society really should only be paying for new innovation and not old innovation. And so what the larger companies find is it's very difficult to develop enough new innovation in their own 4 walls to replace the ones that are going off patent. And so that has created a cycle of innovation that often comes from small and mid-cap companies that then ultimately ends up in the hands or gets acquired by the larger companies who need more innovation. Small and mid-cap biotech companies are developing 65% of the new therapies today. Those are not well represented in the large indices. So this is where we can find innovation that is not yet in the benchmarks.
Talk to us a little bit about how you got interested in investing in this industry, which is very volatile, very risky, but pretty exciting.
I come from a long line of physicians, so my mother, my father, my grandmother, and grandfather were all physicians, so you could say that medicine runs in my blood. But I was always interested in both sides. I was interested in the medical side, but also the business side of healthcare. And so becoming an investor really allowed me to use both of those interests. And I thought that I could have a bigger impact as an investor than I could as a practicing physician. And what's been really gratifying is that's turned out to be true.
The industry has gone through a lot of changes. How do you keep up with the science and the market opportunities?
Yeah, it gets more challenging every year because the number of companies keeps growing. We've actually grown our team over time. We've added a few new analysts to help in biotech over the last few years. And it gets more and more challenging. Just in the last 5 years, there have been 228 new medicines approved by the FDA. That's up about 100% from where we were 10 years ago. So the number of opportunities keeps growing, and the challenge of keeping up with it continues to grow as well. But it's also extremely exciting. The field is moving faster than we've ever seen. The advances are coming. And there's always volatility in this market. We've seen substantial volatility over the last year and a half, but we think that creates the opportunity.
Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, thanks.